When Bob and I started thinking about this series, among the first names we thought of immediately was today's speaker. And he was an immediately logical choice for talking about interactive and progressive and productive interactions between philosophy and the sciences. Maxwell Bennett was born and educated in Melbourne and has been a faculty member at the Department of Physiology at the University of Sydney for all of his postgraduate career. And he is the university chair in physiology and the director of, if I correct, it's not in here, the Brain Studies Institute, something along those lines. Indeed, Maxwell's interest in neuroscience and philosophy go back to his roots. He was an undergrad studying in engineering and in physics, but with a great interest in philosophy. And he, as a result of a decision early on in his education that the productive way to study consciousness and humans was through neuroscience, he then, by his account, sort of wandered into neurobiology. Starting immediately as an undergraduate, just finishing his engineering degree, he did some early and revolutionary discoveries or experiments on the discovery of unusual synapses in the autonomic nervous system, in the viscera. And by applying his electrical engineering know-how to tissues and questions that were at the periphery of other people's interests, he made, as a young man, tremendously important contributions that have established his career on the physiology of the synapse, in particular the interaction of synapses with muscles, etc. Of course, Max describes this as an accident, but it's a perfect example of the way in which the outsiders with a new toolbox who are uninhibited by the dogma within the field actually can make revolutionary contributions. Max showed that the physiology of these autonomic nerves were quite distinct, and decades later was able to establish that this novel neurotransmitter involved in these was ATP. Max went on to make more revolutionary discoveries in response of neurons to injury, synapse formation, the interaction of synapses with muscle fibers, and the role of non-cholinergic synapses in brain and the modulation of in pain, and the modulation of the immune system. Now, beginning in the 1990s, Max began to return to his original interest in philosophy that complemented his ongoing neuroscience work. And since 1998, he has published 7 books, some with his collaborator, Oxford philosopher Peter Hacker, and they include The Idea of Consciousness, The History of the Synapse, Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience with Peter Hacker, History of Cognitive Neuroscience, again with Peter Hacker, and most recently, in 2013, Virginia Woolf and Neuropsychiatry. He tells me for his next book that he is interested in returning to one of his favorite philosophers, Spinoza, and I think that project is ongoing. Of course, Max is the recipient of numerous awards and prizes, and I won't get into all of those, but today he will deliver the first of a pair of talks on the history of mind. Tomorrow, here at the Whitney Humanities Center at 1 o'clock, he will continue with a companion lecture on the history of consciousness. So please join me in welcoming Maxwell Bennett.
We human beings have a corporeal body and a range of psychological capacities or powers, remembering, feeling, perceiving, thinking, etc. The basis of my presentation is to look at the history of the relationship between this corporeal structure and these psychological powers. Much to my surprise, I believe that the story begins 5,000 years ago, where really the paradigm for our thinking about this subject in the subsequent periods was laid down by the Egyptians. Not to bore you too much, because it's actually quite exciting when you get into it, what the Egyptians believed is indicated here in this diagram. Here is the shadow, or the shoot, which the Egyptians thought was actually a live process, much the same as probably a few thousand years earlier the shamans had thought. When we go to sleep, we dream. And we dream sometimes about ourselves, sometimes about dearly beloved ones that have now passed on, sometimes about our enemies. But these dreams are full of shadowy figures, including ourselves. We can identify people sometimes in the dreams as a consequence of the silhouette, the shape of the person in the dream. But really, in the context of shamanism and in the context of the way the Egyptians thought about the dreams, they thought that the shadow that they cast on the ground was probably much the same as the kinds of figures they met in their dreams, including themselves. So the shoot or shadow was a very real object for them both when they were asleep and when they were awake. But it had no personality. It was, in a sense, a walking, comatose individual. So we could not in any way attribute to that the idea of immortality or something of that kind. But in addition to the shoot, and the most important element in the theology of the Egyptians was the bar, this incongruous figure of a bird with wings but with a human head. And what this is really a metaphor for is the fact that when you die, you are judged. And your judgment is on the basis of the weight of your heart. The weight of the heart was measured against a feather, so it had to be a pretty light heart. And of course, since this was a religious idea, the extent to which the weight of your heart indicated you'd led a good life was really on the basis of how much money you'd paid to the priest of the temple. So that if you had a very light heart and you got through this process, then you'd coughed up quite a lot of money probably. So you then got through to a stage in the afterlife where you were the bar. And the bar had a very good time because most of the day it flew off to the area where one had lived when one was alive, and you partook in all the gossip and carryings on of the society and of the family that you loved. And then in the evening, you had to come back to the region of the tomb. And you came back to the region of the tomb because, as we all know, in order to proceed through the day, we need some kind of energy. We need to be vital in some way. And just the same as we do, the Egyptians believed that we needed food. And so this food gave us energy, or the ka, as the Egyptians thought of it. And so the bird had to come back to the tomb because, in general, that's where the food was to be found. Now, of course, the food was presented around the tomb in a metaphorical sense. I mean, wine was there and matters of that kind left by people who loved us, but this was just a symbol of the fact that one had to return to the tomb in order to receive the energy of the ka. So the bar and the ka were essential parts of this story. Now, when you first hear about this in the Book of the Dead, you kind of think, well, this is a kind of strange kind of fairy tale. But the following table sets out the succeeding 5,000 years of our considerations of the relationship between the mind, the corporeal, and other matters. Why do I suddenly introduce the word mind? It's to actually alert you to the fact that the way we use the word mind these days is really just another way of talking about our psychological powers. We say, mind your step, perceive or look where you're going. We say, keep that in mind, remember that. Or we say, mind what you'll say, namely think about it before you actually say it. So in common parlance now, the word mind has come to mean these kinds of psychological powers. So when I ask the question, what is the relationship between our psychological powers and our corporeal body, in a sense I'm asking them, what is the relationship between our mind and our corporeal body? Now, to some extent, I think the way the Egyptians thought about this, and is indicated here, shows you the power of their thinking. I'm afraid to say you'll have to read something which is kind of like an academic table. But what we have here is the way in which the actual Egyptians thought around about 3000 BC. We have the shoot or the shadow, which was a spirit-type substance, if you like, but which was unrelated to our personality but had something to do with us. And it's rather the same way as the shaman still practice their ideas about the afterlife. But as I've just put emphasis on the bar, namely the head of the bird here, which did have your individuality. It did have your personality, as I think I've exemplified in my little homologue about that. And then the car is the force, or the nutrient, if you like, that's necessary to keep the bar going all the time. What I didn't refer to explicitly was the jib, or the heart, which is weighed up at the time of judgment. But the heart was related to our emotions, which is something which comes naturally to us because when we're excited and what have you, we feel quite often our heart beating more vibrantly. Now, these notions of a separation of three elements here, what we would regard the most important, namely the individuality, the bar, but also up here, emotions, and down here, or intentions, and down here, the life force, is a continuing tripartite division we find in the next 3,000 years at least. So when we come through to the next major period here, we're really dealing at this time here with Homer. And what we have with Homer is a continuation of this idea of a spirit, lacking any individuality at all, but continuing on. Now, though, it's called something which we're all familiar with, not a shoot, but a psyche. And so the psyche, which was just a renaming, in a sense, of the shoot of the Egyptians, only now we're dealing with 8th century BC and not 3000 BC. Also, a renaming here of the seat of our body, of the emotions and of the intentions, by calling it thymus rather than calling it the jib. And then when we come to reasoning, or individuality in this case, we have another word which we're familiar with, and that is nous. I don't think that person's got much nous. They're not very intelligent. Unfortunately, Homer didn't take on the fact that we need nutrient and we need energy in order to continue throughout the day. But he did resurrect, if you like, for reasons which I think we can follow now historically, these ideas of the Egyptians some nearly 2,000 years after they were originally brought into practice. Now we come into the classical Greek period where those giants Plato and Aristotle occurred. Now, Plato took these ideas and rejuvenated them about 300 years after Homer, but with the following huge difference. Because with Homer, the psyche and the thymus and the nous all died at our corporeal death. When we lost the corporeal, we lost the lot. Now, that certainly didn't happen with the Egyptians, as I've stressed. And with Plato, it didn't happen either. So Plato resurrected the concept that this was immortal. And furthermore, he resurrected the concept that we needed something in the way of a nutritive activity like the car that the Egyptians had. Nous, or nous, if you like, is translated as the mind here. And so the mind, or the nous, is at this time associated with reasoning, with thinking capacity, if you like, and very closely associated with our personality. But here, with the psyche, the thymus, the nous, and the id, paralleling the Egyptian show, these are now immortal, like they were with the Egyptians, and like they were not with Homer at all. Plato had one of the worst experiences that any academic can have. He had a student who was cleverer than himself, and that student was Aristotle, of course. I hate to say it, but my hero, so I give my story away. Aristotle pointed out to his master that this system couldn't work. It couldn't work because you cannot take an immortal spiritus substance and relate it to a corporeal physical body with extension. How do you join them together? What sort of bridge could you use? What kind of bridging substance? The whole system won't work. Aristotle escaped this dilemma by saying something which is resurrected only 60 years ago by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And that is that our psychological capacities and including our rationality and thinking, and also our nutritive powers, these were not a substance at all. They were capacities or powers. And you don't have to have a bridging problem then confronting you when you're trying to relate capacities to the corporeal body. He escaped that problem, if you like, by introducing this way of looking at the whole matter. Now, this preeminent genius, not only, as Charles Darwin says in the first page of the Origin of the Thesis, the greatest biologist that ever lived, but he also was extremely interested in physiology. And so he had to ask himself, having set out this system here, had to ask himself, well, amongst other things, how do we move the corporeal body? What is the mechanism of its movement? And he said, well, the best way of considering this, since it's such an extraordinary thing to be able to locomote around the place, that he envisaged the fact that the whole of our atmosphere, reaching out to the stars, was actually contained and suffused by something which we, until recent times, were still using, namely that it was a kind of a plenum. It was a kind of a substance which we could breathe in all the time, and when we breathed it in, something from the stars, it was able to be taken into the lungs, taken to the heart, where it became what he called vital pneuma. And the vital pneuma inside the heart now was transferred down through the blood vessels to the muscles. And it was blood vessels which moved muscles. Nerves were not known at that stage. It was the blood vessels that moved the muscles. So this was one important kind of physiological activity opened up. How does the corporeal body move? What is the mechanism by which this occurs? The other problem which he opened up, and one which has been figuring a great deal in the neurosciences in the last 20 years, was this. When I look at you, a gentleman sitting in the second row here, and see he's wearing a blue jumper and he's falling asleep as I'm talking now actually, with his head down like that, and he's yawning, and he's turning to his mate, and he's itching himself here. How is it that I take this in as a synoptic figure? Someone with this colour, this shape, moving in this way, making these sounds. So he said there must be somewhere in the body what he called the sensus communis. That is the common sense, where the five senses that we have, smell and perception, that is observation, hearing, touch, these sorts of things, where these five senses are brought together so we have a synoptic view of things. And for a long, long time, including recent times, the concept of the sensus communis and where it should be, and if there is such a concept at all, has dominated some parts of neuroscience. So that was not by any means an irrelevant way of thinking about the action of these psychological capacities having to be brought together in the sensus communis. The biggest shake-up of this whole theory going back to the Egyptians occurred, as you all know, in the 17th century as due to Descartes. Descartes shook the whole thing in a dramatic way, and I'm afraid to say that nearly all of you still live under the shadow of Descartes' thought. I'll hold that until tomorrow, because Descartes brings in the idea of consciousness, which I'm not going to touch on today. But what I am going to touch on today is the fact that following this period where Aristotle had developed these schemes, there was no major movement about this question of relating the psychological to the corporeal until about the 1st century AD. And that was due to one of the greatest medical figures in history, and that was due to Galen in Rome, a Greek. What Galen was able to do was something that I think neuroscientists and neurologists have been doing ever since. He got his hand on some cadavers, great material for researching this topic, and he also was able to examine people who were still alive who had had some very severe injuries, and he had a lot of them to examine because he put his tent up just outside the Colosseum, and as the gladiators came out with their various terrible wounds, some of them dead, he immediately grabbed them and made a very close examination of what kind of lesions they had and to what extent that had changed their behaviour. Now, he discovered something which is quite profound, because what Aristotle had said back here in the 4th century BC is that he thought really, as another part of his physiology argument, that when we perceive the world, we actually need an organ to sustain our capacity to see things, and that organ was most likely the heart. And so medicine was practiced really over that period of nearly 400 years on the basis that the heart has to be in good condition for you to be able to perceive. Galen put all that to rest because he showed that in many of these gladiators, if they had an injury to the heart, they just dropped dead. But if they had injuries of a certain kind to the head, then they might have lost, for example, sight, or they might have lost, for example, being able to have the capacity to hear. They would have lost some of their perceptive capacities. Furthermore, their personalities might have changed if they'd had a big blow to the frontal lobes. So he was able to show and argue that it wasn't the heart that you needed for perception, that you needed the head as the organ that was required for you as a human being to perceive the world. Well, the question which immediately came up then is, well, what happens to the physiology of Aristotle about this vital pneuma business of breathing in the ether, which was the plenum that Aristotle named the ether, permeated the whole of the universe. You breathe in the ether, it goes into your lungs, to your heart, becomes vital pneuma, blood vessels. Well, if the heart's not important, what's going on? And what Galen picked up on was what must be going on. As you breathe in the ether, it goes into your heart, becomes vital pneuma, and then it's pumped up into the head where it becomes psychic pneuma, because the psychic had been brought in already by Plato. So we have the psychic pneuma in the head as the core of our capacity to be able to move and organise our limbs, because we now knew about nerves. So nerves left the head, taking the psychic pneuma to the muscles, and we could now move our muscles. Now that might sound to be academic, used in the usual pejorative sense as nonsense or irrelevant, but it isn't, as I will touch on a little while. So our psychological capacities are somehow related to our heads. Well, there's a lot of stuff in the head. What part of the head is relevant was not really tricked out by Galen. It was tricked out some 300 years later, around about the beginning of the 4th century AD, it was tricked out by Bishop Nemesis. Bishop Nemesis didn't do any experiments, which was a very unwise thing to do. What he argued was that you could work out which part of the head was involved by simply looking at, for example, the open skull of a donkey. If you open up the skull and look at a donkey's head, that is what we would now call the cortex, it has crenations of one kind or another, what we call gyri and sulci, and they look exactly the same as what we see when we open up the skull of a human being. So that cannot have anything to do with our psychological capacities, because clearly we are cleverer and we have lots of other attributes that donkeys don't have. So he hit on the idea, and don't forget this is just at the beginning, around about 300 AD, this is a time when he set in place the doctrine which is then called the Ventricular Doctrine. That is, it is the fluid-filled parts of the brain, the ventricles, which are responsible for our psychological ability of thinking, remembering, perceiving, and what have you. Medicine was then practiced for nearly 1,500 years on the basis of the fact that if something had gone wrong with the fluid-filled ventricle, the middle ventricle, for example, you would lose your memory. If something had gone wrong with the fluid-filled ventricle up here, you would lose your rationality. If something had gone wrong with the fluid-filled ventricle down here, then your capacity for perception would be in trouble, as shown here. So here is a classical medical diagram of the time. The fluid-filled ventricles, very beautifully designed here. Something on which these days we spend a lot of our time, namely the neocortex, given this kind of filigree activity as the walls of the ventricle. But the cortex of the brain was just there to be the wall of the ventricles, because it was in the ventricles where all the action was. It was only about this time, after this drawing was made, around about the 15th century now, that the question not only of where our psychological capacities are in terms of our needing an organ to sustain them, but also a return to the question of where is the sensus communis. And that genius Leonardo da Vinci reckoned he'd got it, because he made a drawing which I've actually seen and held, which is now in Windsor Castle. He made a diagram of where the sensus communis, which I've described to you previously, is in the brain, and it's just here. What you've got here is some drawings of Leonardo, and in Latin here, of course, written backwards in his mirror handwriting, what you've got where the vertical line here meets the horizontal line, right there, he said, is the sensus communis. Unfortunately, he didn't leave with us a very good argument as to why that's where the sensus communis is. He didn't tell us why he'd reached that at all, and he's not quoted often in the literature as having found the sensus communis. We now go on to that magic century of genius, probably the greatest century of genius since 5th century Athens, and that is the 17th century. Because it was in the 17th century that we started to move away from the ventricles. Now, how did we come to do that? Well, Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood some 50 years before this experiment was performed that I'm about to describe. And this experiment was one which was conceived on with the professor of anatomy at Oxford, Thomas Willis. This was at the time of the beginning of the Royal Society, with Newton about to take the Lucasian chair of mathematics at Cambridge. And what Thomas Willis did, together with that very versatile character, Christopher Wren, what he did was to conceive of a very good test of the idea that it is the psychic pneuma in the ventricles, which is then removed from there, which Galen had put there in place 100 AD, and goes down the nerves to control the muscle. And the way to do it was to make sure that the psychic pneuma did contain something from the blood. Because Aristotle had said, and Galen had emphasised the fact that in order to get the pneuma into the ventricles where it became psychic pneuma, well, it had to go up through the blood vessels. So the blood vessels must be continuous with the ventricles. So what they did was the first experiment involving the circulation of the blood. They injected, using a thistle, some Indian ink into the carotid artery of a dog. And then after a while, the ink, of course, had passed through the bloodstream and through the circulation that Harvey had just discovered. They then opened up the head and took some sections to see where the ink was. And of course, it was meant to be in the ventricles. And it wasn't. There was no ink in the ventricles at all. The ink was in the cortex, the walls of the actual walls here of, the actual walls of the cortex. I'll get back there eventually, here. Now, this caused a lot of consternation, particularly with Descartes, who was just towards the end of his life. Because what Descartes had done was he had worked out a plan of how the corporeal body relates to the Platonic soul or Platonic mind. And the way he had done this, Descartes had said, when you look at the body, what you see is in the midline here, the pineal gland. It's not bifurcated at all. It's the only structure which is not duplicated to some extent on each side. So it must be that part of the body which takes the corporeal message and gives it over to the psychic pneuma in the ventricles. So what Descartes did was to show us how it happens. And here, up here, is his drawing of a ventricle. Here is the psychic pneuma in here, in the ventricle, the fluid, the ventricle. Here is the pineal gland. And here, these little furry lines here indicate what Aristotle said could not happen. Namely, here is the interaction between the corporeal and the psychic pneuma, which carried all these messages concerning the psychic capacities and our psychological abilities. Well, the discovery that it was not the ventricles at all really threw the system out of kilter, a system that had been there since the time of Bishop Nemesis. And this drawing, which is by Christopher Wren, of their discovery that it is this cortical material which we really have to pay attention to in relationship to our psychological capacities, and therefore the whole idea of the ventricles, which had been around then for some 1400 years, had to be discarded. There is a certain smugness I detect in some of you in the audience as I look around because of the ludicrous nature of the stories which I'm actually telling you here. I mean, it's quite obvious that this is so and that is so. As you will see when I finish up here, I think to some extent we never escape the paradigms that we're working in, even in contemporary times, and we scoff at what's happened in this case the last 5,000 years, because we're always caught in a very limited scope of knowledge about what's going on. It doesn't pay to be too proud of one's theories or even those which appear to be experimentally verified, as people had argued for 1,300 years with respect to the ventricles. The next question about this cortical material, which we need in order to sustain our psychological abilities, is what composes it? And that really had to wait until the German dye industry got going in the early 19th century. And the idea of a university department was generated in Germany again, and they affiliated with the dye industry. And so we began to see that there were ways of staining tissue. And one of the ways of staining tissue showed up that the cortex, the wall of the ventricle, actually contains cells, which are now called neurons. And here's one here with these lovely long processes that are going everywhere, another one here, and you can see the whole area is covered with these cellular elements. So the cortex is made up with cells. Our psychological capacities seem to be dependent on the workings of, for example, these neurons. Now the brain, the cortex, is a very large sheet. It goes over a long way, and these cells are only of the order of about 1/50th of a millimetre in extent. So how does one part here ever communicate with this part here or anything like that? What's going on here? Well, if you look more carefully, particularly down here, what you see is that there are very long processes, diagrammatically shown here. So here are these neurons, which I showed you in a real stain in the last overhead. And here they are sending out processes, which we call axons, a long, long way over the cortex. Then they come in at another region of the cortex and make a connection. And in the introduction to my diatribe this evening, the fact that I've been working for 55 years on something which is 1,000th of a millimetre wide there, named the synapse, is something which excites me, but obviously doesn't excite some of you very much. So we have these connections going on, and we have the grey matter composed mostly of this. Well, if that's the case, what does the brain actually look like? What does the cortex itself look like? If we take a section through the brain, what do we see, given that most of the cortex is grey matter, that is, neurons, which we now call grey matter, and a lot of it is not grey matter, it's what we call white matter, which are these axons connecting, these nerves connecting a part of the brain here, let's say, to a part here, or a part here to a part there. And you can see that here. What I've got here is a section going that way through the brain, and this grey stuff at the top here is where all those neurons are. Okay, so what Christopher Wren saw in his drawing is just the surface here. That was what his drawing was of, just the surface. The vast amount of the cortex here, all this white matter, are just those axons, those processes connecting one part here to another part there. Okay, so what's all this stuff doing with respect to our psychological abilities? How can you actually nail it down? Which part's responsible for thinking? Which part's for seeing? Which part's for hearing? Which part's for having an emotional attitude to life of one kind or another? What's going on here? It is just over 100 years ago that what's going on in a large part of this was described for the first time here at Yale by one of the two greatest neuroscientists of the 20th century, giving the Silliman lectures here, and that was Sir Charles Scott Sherrington. And what Sherrington did was to show you some of his own work, and also there's some work here of his students, one of the two most famous being Wilder Penfield. And what Wilder Penfield and some of the other students, including Sherrington himself, showed was that, first of all, if you look at the cortex and you stimulate the cortex over the cortex here, then different kinds of things happen to a human being. So Penfield, when he was probing the brain for the region of the brain that would give rise to tremors in a patient with epilepsy, he wasn't allowed to take any little person off the street, open up their skull and do these experiments. There had to be some neurological basis for him doing them. He was actually probing the brain and stimulating it electrically to try and find the region where this person would suddenly give a large jerk, indicating that this was a sensitive region, if you like, for giving rise to epilepsy. But in the course of these experiments, he made a number of extremely interesting discoveries. One was that when he stimulated out here at the back of the brain, just here, the person saw visual changes, not auditory ones, no changes in mood, no changes in thinking, but there would be changes in the visual field. Part of the visual field would suddenly get very bright, or another part would get very dark, or suddenly a stripe would appear in another part of the visual field. If you stimulated anywhere else, that never happened. If you stimulated down here, which is just along the edge here, the temporal lobe, the so-called superior temporal gyrus, you stimulate along here, the person heard sounds. They could be hissing sounds, loud sounds, not vision at all, but sounds. In fact, he had one patient, a female patient, who when he stimulated a certain region here, actually, she was an elderly lady, about 83, she actually heard a Beethoven symphony. It was an Eroica Symphony. She said it was a fantastic performance, which she'd last heard when she was 16. And Penfield thought that was a lot of nonsense, and he went and checked it out at the Toronto Town Hall, Penfield being a Canadian, and working then in the Montreal Clinic. He went to the Toronto Town Hall and found the records for the particular concert this woman had attended, and lo and behold, there was the Eroica Symphony. So this was to do with certainly audition. Then when he came up here, those dots are all the way along there, he found he could get movements of limbs, and of the face, grimaces, movements of that kind. And then when he stimulated just behind there, he was able to get effects where the patient said they had tingles in their fingers. It was as if parts of their skin were actually active in some way. These were very interesting observations with respect to our perception capacities, because it suggested that vision, at least, was associated with a particular part of the cortex, something which was amplified a great deal 5 years after Sheraton gave his lectures here at Yale during the First World War, the 100th anniversary of which we are commemorating next year, because of the enormous number of shrapnel wounds on the Western Front, taking bits of the cortex out. And neurologists, just like at the same time as Galen acted on the gladiators, they went, grabbed these persons that had had these terrible shrapnel wounds, checked out what had happened to their behaviour and found out they couldn't see. So vision was very well consolidated as being associated with this part here. But the interesting question is, what about nearly 80% of the cortex indicated here, which Penfield couldn't get anything? Not vision, hearing, behaviour of any kind, muscle movement, anything at all. Well, as Sheraton pointed out in his lectures here 100 years ago, this is what we know, he said. We know that down here is the temporal lobe associated in this part here with audition. And we know over here concerned with vision. We know over here, along here, concerned with something to do with skin and feeling. And we know, as indicated in red here, something to do with movement. But we don't know what all this is about. Well, some of you will be aware that we do other things besides see the world. We do other things than perception. We do other things than move our limbs. We actually, some of us think, and we remember, and we do things like that. So maybe some of this has got to do with that. And so maybe we could find here and colour in a different colour, the thinking bit. And for a large part of the 20th century, that was thought to be the thinking bit up here. And maybe up here we might find the emotional bit. Up here we might be able to compartmentalise it further. Probably one of the great breakthroughs in trying to sort out what's going on here and here and here, or at least technically a great breakthrough, was the invention by Sheraton, as he indicated here when he came to Yale from Oxford to give his lectures, the invention by Sheraton of what we would now call non-invasive imaging of the brain, where we can record the activity of neurons without actually having to break up the brain into different bits and pieces. And the way he did that was to use this device. This is what I call, for the cognoscenti in the audience, the reasonably modern functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And what Sheraton thought, together with a colleague of his, who was professor of pathology, he thought maybe there's changes on the surface of the brain here, this was a monkey, not a human being, when the monkey does something. Maybe we can detect something. because they thought that if they just looked down and, for example, stimulated a nerve here to do with muscle, then when they went to the part of the brain up here, when they went to the part of the brain, I'm jumping through there. When they went to the part of the brain here, which when was stimulated moved muscle, then maybe when you move your muscle voluntarily, then there would be neural activity here. And since neurons probably need some form of nutrient, which even the Egyptians realised was the case, not neurons in their case, but the body needed nutrient, then the only thing that could supply that would be blood flow. So maybe there would be a change in blood flow here, indicating that neurons were active, because when they become active, they need more nutrient. The nutrient comes from the blood vessels, and the blood vessels have to therefore increase flow, and therefore they have to increase volume too. So if we could get a measure of the volume of blood vessel changes here some way, we would have an indirect measure of neural activity. We wouldn't have to stimulate, we could just watch the animal, in this case, move its arm, and then record up here the changes in the blood vessels, which would indicate to us that there'd been some neuronal activity here. And the device which he used to do that is here. It's an upturned flask placed on the surface of the cortex. And it's got this end of the flask broken off, and it's full of fluid up to about level there. And all he did was to, for example, stimulate a nerve which goes to a muscle here, and then see whether in fact there was a change in blood flow here, because the blood vessels had increased in diameter. The fluid then moves up the tube, indicating there's been a change in volume, and therefore a change in neural activity. Now, the basis of much of the imaging that goes on these days that you read in the New York Times all the time is that concept that blood flow, blood changes of some kind are related to neural activity. We don't have to open up the skull like that anymore, but it's the same concept that it's blood flow in some form or other, or constituent of blood, which is changing, related to neural activity. Therefore, we measure the blood flow, then we will get a handle on that neural activity. All right, so he did the experiment, he got a huge change in blood flow when he stimulated the nerves which control muscles, so he said, wow, this is the way to go. And he went back home to Oxford, having given his Silman lectures. Well, if we use this technique now, what does it tell us about these large swathes here, and here, and here, and here, for which we've got no handle yet, certainly up to the time in which I described it, of any activity, as Penfield couldn't find anything with his electrodes, that's for sure. Well, let me give you an example of what we now find, certainly in the last few years. What I'm showing you here is a lot of dots of different colours. And in this particular experiment, what happened was that the patient here was asked to distinguish the names on a screen, projected on a screen, of a number of items. Let's say it was an apple, an orange, a stick, etc. And just remember it for a few seconds, 10 seconds or 20 seconds. The image on the screen was taken away. And then the next thing would be actual shapes. An apple, an orange, a pear, a stick, a book, what have you. And just remember the shapes, rectangle, elongated. And then finally, another projection. How many items there? 3 or 6 or 12? The item's taken away from the screen. You're given 20 seconds to keep in memory what it was. Then you're asked how many. You say 20, or you make a wrong number, 6, whatever. Now, when you do those, and you do the upturned flask routine, then the regions of activity over the brain, cumulatively, by those 3 sorts of activities, are indicated here. You'll see each of these little dots here indicates a region which is active. Now, you can see there's a bit of a cluster there. The yellow dots are clustered, the red ones, to bring out the fact they're clustered, are coloured differently, black ones differently here, and so on. And we can just give you here the centre of the clusters. So here is the red cluster at the centre there, and so on here. So these here now are the centres of the clusters. Now, what it turns out is that when you look at the collection of items and you ask to remember them in terms of their shape, then this region here of the brain is very active. This region is not very active here. This region here is less active. This region over here is quite active, and so on and so forth. when you're asked to remember not the names of the objects or their shape, but the number of objects, or vice versa, their shape, then you get the same clusters being active, but in a different kind of quantitative activity. So instead of this being the highest region of activity, it's now the lowest region of activity. And instead of this one being an intermediate level of activity, it's now the highest level of activity. What am I saying here? What I'm saying is that those regions which Penfield couldn't get anything out of seem to have a very distributed representation, and I use that word very advisedly, representation of your capacity in memory to retain things on the basis of them either being spatially organised, numbers organised, or in terms of the actual names of the objects. There is no, as it were, sensus communis here, there is no sight equivalent to the great perception sites of audition and of hearing, I should say, and of vision and what have you. There's not just a sight here for memory over a short term. It seems to be distributed over those regions of cortex which Penfield was unable to get anything out of when he electrically stimulated it. Now, for those of you who are not amongst the cognoscenti and that I'm still caught in some kind of interest in this topic, I'm not going to bore you by going through many other examples of this kind of distributed activity, except to emphasise that it isn't in a particular part of the brain. It tends to be all over the place, if you like, not quite as bad as that. My final example is this one, which really, I think, brings home the case. Here are different sites, both in the midline of the brain and over the surface of the brain here, from which recordings are made when someone was looking at a screen and asked to distinguish between the fact that there were numbers on the screen versus whether, in fact, there was alphabet on the screen. As simple as that. Numbers or alphabet. Push the red button if it's numbers, push the green button if it's alphabet. Now, when they did that, each of these recordings was made at different sites. So the sites are numbered there, you probably can't see them, but this number 12 here goes to the number 12 there, and so on and so forth. So the point is that at every time you get one of these signals like that there, the subject was asked to make this distinction between a number or a letter of the alphabet. Then nothing at all. Then they were asked to make a distinction again, then nothing at all, and then so on. So this is here a sequence of 5 such distinctions between a number or a letter of the alphabet. And you can see this is a very regular kind of increase in amplitude, if you like, of blood flow, indicating increase of neural activity in that part of the brain. But in this part of the brain, the activity goes in the opposite direction. The activity is not getting bigger here, it's getting less. And in this part of the brain, it's neither getting bigger nor getting less. It's going up, then during the actual distinction between alphabet or numbers, it's going down, and then when you've completed the task, it goes up again. Now, if you proceed to determine where all these are coming from over the surface of the brain, what you can do is you can colour them all in. So here is each of those signals I showed you, but they've been given different colours. This one went down, this one went up, this one went down, and so on and so forth. And if you distribute those colours over the brain to see when the person was making these distinctions, what parts of the brain are involved, you can see that everything is involved. Everything is coloured over the whole cortex. Those different signals, each of which was distinguished by a different colour, is coming up in different regions. So what I'm doing is emphasising a great deal, and perhaps overemphasising the fact that this is not all collected in one part of the brain, and furthermore, the signals are very weird shapes of one kind or another, which we haven't got any public knowledge of at present as to where and why we have these different signals. And I might add, just to emphasise why you should be slightly sceptical about the New York Times, even though it's a wonderful newspaper, and that is that most researchers throw away a lot of this data. They say, I only like the big signals. The little signals, well, you know, the Lord didn't make this cortex to have little signals. He only wanted big signals, or she only wanted big signals. So we'll only keep the big signals. Or others say, look, you couldn't possibly have the signals that go down. We'll only take the ones that go up, and so on and so forth. There are now 36,800 research papers on this topic. And many of them, just to build up your scepticism, work on the basis that I only like big signals, or they work on the basis that we should only have signals of a certain shape, and so on and so forth. That is a very sad, I think, story. And I think it's a story very akin, and I hope it doesn't go as long as 1,300 years in the Ventricular Doctrine, but you never know. It's making a lot of money, and the Ventricular Doctrine probably made doctors a lot of money also. Now, how come the cortex that Penfield couldn't get anything out of, how come it's all active all over the place? Well, we now have teased out that white matter I showed you underneath the top of the cortex, that white matter of axons or nerves connecting one part to another, and it's magnificent. And I'll just give you an inkling of it here. This is a human brain. This is not a dead person. You can now do this with imaging techniques. And here is a tract of axons. There's thousands of them in there of nerves connecting the front part, that's called the cingulum, to the back part of the brain. And here's all sorts of other major nerves which constitute that white mass I showed you in that section through the brain. So there's this massive interconnectedness between one part of the brain and the other. And therefore, it's not at all surprising that when we go to the more complex parts of our psychological abilities, remembering over extensive periods of time, let alone getting into the area of thinking, or as Bob Schulman and I have been talking about recently, of falling in love, or something of that aspect of our activity, let alone getting into that game, we are in a very complex arrangement of cortical activity, and we haven't sorted any of it out by a long shot. One of the most disturbing aspects of our work, which really requires Aristotle, Wittgenstein's dead, has been so for 65 years, we really need Aristotle back. And that is this word representation. It is rife throughout the neuroscientific literature. Now, it makes no sense because it's totally Cartesian. Because when I was on Saturday at the Met looking at Cézanne's still lifes, here was the apples and oranges on the table. Okay, and so I'm looking at these apples and oranges. Cézanne painted this. It's a representation of apples and oranges. Who is it a representation of apples and oranges for? It's for me. It's for me, a patron of the arts, looking at the apples and oranges. That brings up the point is, who is this representation of these signals up here? Who is it for? Who's looking down and saying, ah, there it is. He can distinguish between the alphabet and numbers, or whatever the case may be. The word representation has led us into this game of kind of gradually working our way through the Cartesian philosophy to a point where we're almost evaporating ourselves because we don't know where we're going at all. Because clearly there's no little homunculus up there at all, sitting down, watching the TV set, which is the stream of our lives' experiences as expressed in our psychological powers. So to summarise, where have we come in the 100 years since Sherrington stood in Yale and gave his talk? Well, this is what he gave us 100 years ago, as I've already emphasised. And what we have here is the motor cortex and the auditory cortex and the visual cortex and so on. What I'm indicating to you is that once we get out of these kinds of straightforward perception inputs, if you like, and our motor output, once we've got out of that area and we're in this game here, then we have been in real trouble. And although there are claims and counterclaims present all over the place, and there's thousands of papers, just as there probably were over the 1,300 years of the ventricular document, we are, of that particular idea, we are in trouble. What we are claiming at present, as compared to Sherrington, is this. Sherrington's title of his lectures was The Integrative Nature of the Nervous System. And he published a book, which was a monograph summarising his Yale lectures, which was called just that, The Integrative Nature of the Nervous System. What Sherrington had showed was our able to move, our reflexes, our capacity even to walk, could all be worked out in terms of integration of the nerves in the spinal cord, not involving the head at all. And that was a remarkable thing. So in the 100 years since then, with all this here, what have we got? Well, what we have got is that certainly there's some kind of integration going on. But it isn't straightforward at all. It involves multiple dynamic activities between one part and another, all occurring within the time that we're carrying out or participating in the behaviour associated with the psychological act. So these powers of ours, which I mentioned in my introduction, of perception and voluntary movement and of memory and of the affections and of sensations, all of these powers are clearly have got something to do with this system up here, that we know a little bit about what's involved up there, but we're really at the beginning of a very long journey, and it's getting tougher as we go on. Thank you very much.